Goldman Sachs published a report that caught a lot of attention. 300 million jobs would be replaced by artificial intelligence. That number spread fast. Financial news, social media, video thumbnails everywhere. It probably landed in your feed too. But before that number reshapes the way you're thinking about the next 10 years, let me show you what it actually represents. The United States has about 165 million employed workers, the entire country. Goldman Sachs's 300 million estimate is a global figure. Workers across every continent, every industry, every economy. When you isolate just the American workforce, the number that's actually exposed to automation risk is closer to 45 million jobs. That is still a substantial number. But McKinsey's research adds an important layer. Roughly 60% of those 45 million jobs are in fields where workers can retrain within 18 months. Not a full career reinvention. Not 5 years of school. 18 months to add skills that open a different door. So if you're 62 and you saw that headline and felt a shift in your stomach, that reaction makes sense. The number was presented in a way designed to alarm. But the math, when you actually pull it apart, is more manageable than the headline suggests. That doesn't mean the risk is zero. It isn't. But the risk is also not what most people are picturing right now. So if the headline number is misleading, what does that mean for your retirement? The real question is whether your specific job sits inside that risk window and whether you have enough runway to act before the window closes. AI is not eliminating every job at once. That's not the mechanism. What it is doing, steadily across industry after industry, is replacing the most repetitive parts of cognitive work: entering data, processing standard claims, preparing routine financial reports, answering first-tier customer questions. These tasks can now be handled faster and more cheaply by software than by a person. The people who tend to feel most secure are often the most exposed. I've watched this happen more than once. Someone with 25 or 30 years of experience in a stable, mid-level role, assuming that tenure and institutional knowledge are enough protection. In some fields they are. In others, that experience is in exactly the type of work automation targets first. The Bureau of Labor Statistics identifies accounting clerks, customer service representatives, and data entry specialists as among the occupations with the steepest projected declines over the next decade. Now add a second problem sitting alongside this one. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to be depleted by 2033. If Congress takes no action, benefits would be cut by 23% at that point. Not eliminated, reduced. But 23% is not a small number when it's the floor you planned your retirement around. Take John and Mary. John is 62 and has been a mid-level accountant at a regional firm for 30 years. Mary is 60 and works part-time as an administrative assistant. They plan to keep working until 67, then file for Social Security together. They were on track, or thought they were. Last month, John's firm announced a shift to AI-based bookkeeping. His position may be eliminated within 2 years. That changes everything. If John loses his job at 64 and can't find comparable work, he may claim Social Security at 62, which permanently reduces his benefit by about 30%. Then if the 2033 cut happens and Congress hasn't acted, a 23% reduction comes on top of that. What he planned as a $2,000 per month benefit could end up closer to $1,080. That's not a worst-case projection. That's the default outcome if nothing changes. Now think about this from Mary's angle. She's watching John's situation unfold in real time. Her administrative role, scheduling, correspondence, basic record keeping, is also in the category that software handles efficiently. If John's income disappears while she's still part-time, the gap between their plan and their reality grows fast. A mortgage, car payment, insurance premiums, everyday expenses, those don't pause while you figure out what comes next. But here's the part the doom and gloom coverage never shows you. There is a hidden math that actually works in your favor, if you know where to look for it. I want to correct something I said earlier. Actually, something I said in a video a few months ago. When the Goldman Sachs report first came out, I shared the 300 million number without breaking it down. I took the headline at face value. Then I went back and read the actual report. The figure covers the entire global workforce, not the United States. I was working off an imprecise summary, and I put that inaccuracy in front of a lot of people. I want to be clear about that. The U.S. exposure is about 45 million jobs. McKinsey's analysis breaks that down further. 60% of those jobs are in fields where workers can realistically retrain within 18 months. The actual number of positions facing both automation pressure and long retraining timelines, the genuinely difficult cases, is roughly 18 million, about 11% of the total American workforce. That is still meaningful, but it is not 300 million. And for most people watching this, the relevant question is simply which category your job falls into. John's position is in the harder to retrain 40%. Standard bookkeeping, routine reconciliation, straightforward reporting. Those are exactly the tasks AI handles most efficiently. His pivot needs to be deliberate, and his timeline is shorter. Mary's administrative work is in the 60% that can move faster. Medical billing is a growing field with a 12-month certification pathway. It requires the kind of human judgment, navigating complex cases, communicating with patients and insurers, catching errors in submitted claims, that routine admin work does not. A clear path exists for her right now. Now, the second part of this framework, which sounds unlikely until you look at the numbers. There is an ongoing policy discussion about what's sometimes called an automation levy. The idea is a modest tax on the economic value generated by automated production, AI software, robotics, machine-driven processes. Companies that replace human labor with automation would contribute a percentage of that output into a fund that supports displaced workers and retirees. The math is not speculative. The United States has an estimated $4,000 billion in automated production annually. A 7% levy generates roughly $280 billion a year. At that scale, you could fund a $1,200 monthly supplement for every American over 60, which would effectively close a significant portion of the Social Security shortfall projected for 2033. This is not a fringe idea. Economists have been modeling versions of it for years. Legislative proposals have been introduced. The support for them tends to grow as the automation numbers become harder to ignore. What this means practically is that your retirement options over the next 10 years are not limited to two bad choices. There are structural policy responses being seriously discussed, and the timeline for some of them is real. So if the math is better than it looks, why does it still feel like the system is working against you? Because there is a historical pattern here, one that repeats in every major economic disruption, that explains why so many people freeze when they should be moving. In 2008, the United States lost 8.7 million jobs over the course of about 18 months. Unemployment hit 10%. The housing market collapsed. A lot of people in their late 50s watched their portfolios fall 40% in less than a year. That was a genuine crisis. And the decisions people made in 2008 and 2009, selling investments at the bottom, claiming Social Security early to cover expenses, pulling money from retirement accounts before penalties, those decisions permanently changed outcomes for a lot of households. The economy recovered. It took several years, but it did. The people who stayed invested and didn't liquidate at the worst moment eventually recovered along with it. The current disruption is different in one important way. The 2008 crisis was cyclical, caused by a financial shock that corrected itself once the underlying problems were addressed. Job displacement from automation is structural. The roles it eliminates don't return when the market stabilizes. But the consistent pattern across every major disruption, the Industrial Revolution, the mechanization of agriculture, the rise of personal computing, the 2008 crisis, is this. Panic runs ahead of reality. Adaptation happens faster than expected. The economy generates new categories of work even as it closes old ones. That doesn't guarantee the same pattern holds this time, but it is a meaningful anchor when everything feels like it's changing too fast to track. Here's the actuarial side of this. If you are 60 today, the Social Security Administration's own actuarial tables show a life expectancy of about 84 years for men and about 86.5 years for women. That means you have, on average, 24 to 26 years ahead of you. 24 years is not a short window. It is enough time to retrain, to restructure when and how you claim benefits, to adjust your saving strategy, and to adapt to whatever the policy environment looks like in 5 or 10 years. The obstacle is rarely time. It's what happens in the mind when change feels too large to move toward. And that is the part most financial planning conversations skip entirely. Psychologists call it normalcy bias. It's the tendency to assume the future will look roughly like the past, even when there is clear evidence something has shifted. It's not a character flaw. It's a cognitive default, the brain's way of managing uncertainty without being overwhelmed by every possible scenario. When the future becomes hard to predict, the mind gravitates toward the most familiar version of what comes next. John and Mary have been in the same roles for decades. Their plan has felt workable. The discomfort of disrupting that plan, even in the face of a genuine threat, feels sharper and more immediate than the risk itself, which is still abstract and maybe someday. I'll be honest. When I first started paying attention to the AI displacement data, my instinct was to find reasons it wouldn't apply to the fields I know. I kept telling myself that experienced people in nuanced roles would be protected. That was my normalcy bias talking. It took me longer than it should have to sit with the numbers as they actually were. The way through it is not a dramatic shift in mindset. It's a more precise question. Instead of asking whether you need to completely change careers, which feels overwhelming and paralyzing, the more useful frame is this. What is one skill you could add in the next 6 months that makes you meaningfully harder to replace in your current field? For Mary, that might be a 3-month certification in medical billing. Not a full reinvention. A targeted addition that opens a specific door without requiring her to start over. That is the kind of step that breaks the freeze. One thing, defined, achievable, with a clear outcome. Once you break the freeze, the math starts looking different because you're making deliberate choices rather than being carried by default ones. Let me show you what the numbers actually look like across 2 different outcomes for John and Mary. First path, John does nothing. He gets laid off at 64. He looks for comparable accounting work, but most of what's available is either entry-level or requires skills he hasn't built. After about a year of searching, he claims Social Security at 62. His full retirement age benefit would have been $2,000 per month. Filing at 62 reduces that permanently by about 30%, bringing it down to $1,400. Then, if the 2033 trust fund depletion happens and Congress hasn't acted, a 23% cut takes that to roughly $1,080. Mary ends up in a similar position. Their combined monthly income lands around $2,100 to $2,200. They had planned on $4,500. That is not a worst-case scenario. That is the default. Second path. John pivots into tax preparation for small businesses. It builds on what he already knows, accounting and financial judgment, but shifts toward work that requires client relationships and situation-specific decisions that software doesn't handle well. He stays employed until 67. Mary completes her medical billing certification and moves into a stable role at a healthcare practice. She also works until 67. Both delay Social Security to full retirement age. John's benefit remains at $2,000. Even with a 23% cut in 2033, that comes out to $1,540 per month. Better than $1,080. Their combined income in the second path is around $2,800 to $3,000 per month before any investment withdrawals. A gap of $700 to $900 per month compared to the first path, sustained over their entire retirement. The difference between those two outcomes doesn't require a major income increase or a complete career reinvention. It requires deliberate decisions made in the next 2 to 3 years. But even the most carefully built plan runs into unexpected disruptions. That's what a stress test is for. Let's say John does everything right. He retrains, delays Social Security, and he and Mary reach 66 in reasonable financial shape. Then John is diagnosed with a chronic condition requiring ongoing care. Not a sudden emergency, a long-term management situation, a cardiovascular issue, or early diabetes with complications. Something that adds a steady cost over time and eventually affects his capacity to work at full pace. Here's where the unprepared version of this goes badly. John has $50,000 in savings outside of his 401k. Medicare covers hospital costs, roughly 80% after deductibles, but Medicare does not cover long-term custodial care. It does not cover a home health aide coming in 4 or 5 days a week. It does not cover an assisted living facility. The average annual cost of a nursing home is $108,000 based on Genworth Financial's 2025 cost of care data. The gap between what Medicare pays and what care actually costs can drain a modest retirement account in 2 to 3 years. A mortgage, a car payment, insurance premiums, daily living expenses. All of that continues while the medical costs layer on top. The math deteriorates fast. The prepared version looks different. At 60, John and Mary looked at hybrid long-term care insurance, a policy that combines a death benefit with a long-term care rider. If you need the care, the policy pays. If you never use it, there's still a benefit for your family. They also built up a health savings account while John had a qualifying high deductible plan. By the time John's condition emerges at 66, they have $30,000 in the HSA, available tax-free for qualified medical expenses. The insurance absorbs the majority of the care cost. The HSA covers the gaps. Their retirement income stays largely intact. A plan that only works when everything goes smoothly is not a plan. It's a projection. The plan that actually holds is one that has been built with a specific disruption scenario in mind, not designed around the best case. The decisions that make that possible need to happen before the disruption, not in response to it. There are 3 things you can actually do, and none of them require going back to school or walking away from the work you've built. Start with your own occupation. The Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Outlook Handbook is free and publicly available. It shows projected growth or decline for hundreds of specific occupations over the next decade. If your occupation shows a projected decline, that is the information you need to start planning now, not in 2 years. If it shows stability or growth, you have evidence rather than assumption. Either way, you know where you actually stand. Second, model your Social Security options before you feel pressure to decide. The Social Security Administration offers a free online benefit calculator that shows what your monthly payment would be at different claiming ages. The difference between claiming at 62 and waiting until 67 can be $400 to $600 per month or more, depending on your earnings history. Over 20 to 25 years of retirement, that gap becomes substantial. If your job is in a vulnerable field, the most protective move is often a bridge plan, using savings, a part-time role, or spousal benefits. That lets you delay your claim even if your employment situation changes first. Third, pay attention to the automation tax discussion as it moves through policy. When legislation around Social Security funding comes up, it tends to move faster when representatives hear from people who understand the specifics. A clear, direct communication from a constituent who can articulate the issue is more effective than most people expect. I know what some of you are thinking, that you're 62 and the idea of learning something new doesn't feel like an option anymore. I've watched that assumption be wrong more times than I can count. A former retail manager, 63 years old, spent 6 months learning to use AI scheduling and workflow tools. She didn't become a software developer. She became a consultant helping small businesses navigate those same tools. She now earns more than she did as a manager, works fewer hours, and sets her own schedule. The skill gap at 63 is usually smaller than it looks. The confidence gap is the harder one to close. Subscribe if this gave you something useful. I'll be covering each of these areas in more detail over the next few weeks. Let me bring this back to where we started. The 300 million number is real. It is also a global figure, not an American one. When you look at just the United States, the exposure is closer to 45 million jobs, and most of those sit in fields where a focused 18-month effort can open a different path. The Social Security shortfall is real too, but there are serious structural discussions happening about closing a meaningful portion of that gap through mechanisms that didn't exist a decade ago. You have more time and more options than the headlines are suggesting. What you don't have is unlimited runway. If this gave you a clearer picture of where things actually stand, subscribe. I put out content aimed at cutting through the noise and giving you something practical. And if you have a question about your specific situation, your job, your Social Security timing, your savings, put it in the comments. I read them. You have put 40 years into this. A retirement that holds together is not too much to expect.